Joining us now on Practical 365 is Justin Kohler from SpecterOps. How are you?
Very good. How are you?
I am fantastic. So, identity is top of most people's minds, or at least it should be. And in our run-up to Tech, the Experts Conference, we're lucky enough to have you with us today to talk a bit more about not only your session, but some of the AD-related stuff around it. So for those that don't know you, would you give us a quick introduction?
Absolutely. So I'm Justin Kohler. I'm the Vice President of Products at SpecterOps. So I own the, if you've ever heard of a tool called Bloodhound before on the open source side, we also have Bloodhound Enterprise and Enterprise product. But I also manage the training at SpecterOps. So we do a considerable amount of training classes. And SpecterOps in general is well known for professional services, so like red teaming, pen testing, detection services, that kind of thing. So
yeah. So is that global? Or is it?
Yeah, we're based in the U.S., but we've got international employees now. Do work for kind of everybody across the globe. You can name them. We've attacked them. You know, they paid us for it, but yeah.
I know where I work. There's a part of the business that does a similar thing, and as well as doing like cyber essentials, things like that, there's the red teaming bit always seems like the most interesting part, and the bit where they sneak into buildings.
The physical side, that's always like where the most fun stories come from. It's also like kind of the opportunity. Well, you're always creative, kind of wherever you go on the red team engagement, but the physical side has the funniest, I think, outcomes most of the time. Yeah. It also can be quite dangerous. Like you can, if you're not coordinated with your client very well, like you could get, guns pulled on you by security and stuff. So, but yeah, those guys have fun.
Yes. But then there's a serious side to this, isn't there? Where, and I think everybody who works in IT knows that there's been some very large companies who have had very serious AD compromises, and
yes.
After moving to the cloud, one thing that people still do have very often, and some do plan to get rid of it. I was on a call with a customer just today when they have got to the point where they're going to remove Active Directory forever. It's a business of 1,200 people, which is quite large actually for the size of business that gets to that point. But many still do keep it. But as people's skills change and interests move on and people move up the ranks from looking after that infrastructure, is it still at risk?
Well, yes.
I mean, I'm asking the obvious question.
That is the obvious question. I mean, yes. Like we've got posts going back years of going from on-prem to Azure, then back down to on-prem. I think there's really good needs for moving to Azure. It enhances a lot, but it in itself is not a panacea. You also we found a lot of clients were moving to Azure too, and they've been punched in the face so many years by Active Directory, so like maybe Azure can solve it. They kind of quickly find out that they can't migrate fully. Like they're always going to be maintaining some hybrid environment, or at least that hybrid maintenance is longer than they expected. So where they might have thought like, let's move in 2 years, it's like, well, let's migrate over the next decade. And then there's some, legacy applications. And in particular, if you're like any type of regulated industry or healthcare, stuff like that, like the systems that you have to unwind are pretty enormously complex. So
and in with that, you've got businesses who have built applications over decades or more but they've followed principles from Microsoft as well, which but when we say moving to Azure, you've got, what was it, Azure Active Directory, which is now helpfully or otherwise been renamed Entra ID, because Azure AD isn't Active Directory. And then you've got Azure.
Yeah, for now. Yeah.
And in Azure, you've got, for now. And in Azure, you've got people who are still running on-premises AD, but in Azure as well, which this is the kind of thing that causes project managers utter confusion when they're expected to understand the differences between these technical terms and aren't necessarily technical themselves. So Azure Infrastructure as a Service, Active Directory Domain Services controllers running in Azure, then Azure Active Directory Domain Services running as a service under, I suppose, Azure AD or Entra ID, and then on premises. So there's a bit of a differentiation between them. And where do you draw the line?
I mean, it's funny because we talk about this, like when you say you use Azure, what does that mean? Because Azure is an amalgamation of like hundreds of services that you could use or not use depending on your organization. And a lot of people kind of just say we have Azure. It's really dangerous to kind of not understand the details of what specifically you are or are not using in those systems. And then like even those individual systems can be enormously complex. I mean, Azure or Entra ID, as it's known today, has a lot of really good security controls that they learned from mistakes in Active Directory, right? So like, for example, you can't have a random unprivileged user have the ability to reset the password of a global admin. Like that is, learning lesson from Active Directory days that they put in place. Amazing. They also don't have like built-in large default groups like domain users, everyone, stuff like that, which has just ripped apart people in the past on the Active Directory side. But they have their own complexities. Like they're extremely powerful, but the complexities and the options that are available to you, if you're really not aware of exactly what that means, it can pop up a lot of different like misconfiguration that spurs attack paths. And we read the stories later. Yeah. So
I can think of people are trying to do the right thing, but don't necessarily know how, such as,
or they might know how. Using PIM. They might know how, but they might know how today, but then it changes.
Yes.
Like it changes all the time.
It changes. And by the time we plan to do it, because we've got so much to untangle, the world moved on. So we want to be using access reviews and we want to be doing this, that, and the other. But we've got 5,000, 10,000 sets of old style groups and assigned permissions. Or people trying to do the right thing and not being able to do it because they've got to get people to agree. So like putting PIM in where it's self-approval with no auditing. Which sounds bad, but I suppose you could say it's better than nothing.
Yeah. I mean, that like rings very true. I mean, you want to adopt some specific control. It takes the organization some time to adapt that control, and then by the time you've actually adopted it, like what has changed, what new learnings have come out, like what new attacks are taking advantage of things. Like just think of the way that you sync the directory. Like if you're in a hybrid environment and you have an Azure Sync service set up, like that itself has so many ways you can sync it, and has changed over the years. So what you did initially could have been secure, best practice, but it requires so much, maintenance and focus to make sure that continues to be the right way to do it. It's a big challenge for folks.
So one thing that I certainly learned that this is on the rise at Tech Europe from some of your colleagues' sessions. That using the AD as means to attack Azure AD is something that in the past, when I've seen customers who've arrived in a situation where they've had a compromise, they've often been quite lucky in that it didn't affect their Azure AD to their knowledge. But we've certainly seen big stories of companies being attacked that way as well, using that as a means to get in. Does that make AD a bigger target in a way?
Yes. So I think AD is a ripe target, but I always think like don't think of it as like AD versus Azure, but like adversaries are always going to find like the easiest route in. So like take mergers and acquisitions, for example. Like a company announces an M&A, and the first thing an adversary is going to do is go attack the subsidiary and wait, right? Because then when they join the trust, like then I have access to the main environment. So like. With the controls around Azure, it's probably an easier way to get in on the AD side and then move to Azure. And quite frankly, depending on how the environment's set up, you may not even need to go to Azure, right? Like again, we talked about like legacy systems still presiding in Active Directory. Most organizations, you can get whatever you want out of their Active Directory environment. I mean, I don't think there's one customer that we work with today that has some a business critical. Let me restate this. Every customer that we have today has some business critical assets still within Active Directory. So why do I need to move on? Right? Like just stay there.
Yeah.
But if I wanted to wreck Azure, yeah, we could do that too. So.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those areas where there's an understanding of things like Azure to a level where they've had people like, it's okay, we've got a landing zone.
Yeah.
There's, I suppose it's a mask for, it makes you feel safer, knowing all the right words and having done things the right way, but not necessarily understood all of the different bits that put it together. And AD is exactly like that, isn't it? Where people know it so long, they've administered it in some form, perhaps their entire careers, and it's been one of the most reliable things Microsoft have made. And I could easily convince myself that whatever the state of an Active Directory, then I'll probably be able to fix it somehow by some various means. And to be honest, I'm not sure what that means if the Active Directory database is compromised. What does that ever mean to somebody? Does that mean that there's data in the directory, permissions that have been set that are not obvious and present a weakness, or there's something there's something that is completely invisible to somebody who has a cursory knowledge of etc and generally manages it day to day using Active Directory users computers or a tool that automates it.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, like with Active Directory is extremely stable, right?
Yeah.
Like it is a testament to what Microsoft built. We pick on Active Directory. Certainly there are flaws in like the token model that has left it open for abuse. However, really like the problem is not necessarily with Active Directory. It's just a complex directory service. It's no different than Azure or AWS IAM or you name it, right? It's just a complex system that if you're not aware of how the configurations are opening up potential attack paths in your environment, like you're just going to do things without realizing it. And this isn't a reflection on Microsoft or the admin. It's just a configuration problem. So,
yeah. So when AD is compromised, then what are the? I don't think it's a good question to say. What are the things that make it obvious, apart from having tooling and things like that? But is it even possible for some types of compromise of AD where you think you've cleaned everything out to be fully sure that you have? Is there a situation where things look bad and then you've managed to fix it? Is that possible?
Like cleaning up an incident or cleaning up bad configurations that could lead to an attack?
I suppose you've got to do one before the other, right? In some ways, both at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, on the cleaning up an incident side, I mean, we've got folks at firms or friends at firms that do that. So like Mandy and, that's what they do every day. But on the like, how do you know if you've cleaned it up? How do you know if you've cleaned up the attack paths that led to the breach? Well, you have to have some way of seeing it today.
Yeah.
And of course, like, again, my background, running the Bloodhound open source team and the enterprise team, like, I have a bias here. But if you have to have some way of seeing the attack paths that are being formed. I mean, the Active Directory users and computers is an extremely powerful tool. It's great for provisioning users. It does nothing to show you where, like, true privilege lies.
Yeah.
So whether you use us or something, you have to have the ability to see this, and it allows you to verify if you've actually fixed something or not. And typically the external tools move a little bit faster in terms of reflecting the active research in the security community versus, like, the built-in tools, which a little bit slower for good reason. I'm not picking on anybody here, but a little bit slower to adapt kind of that, like, the newer attacks that might be affecting the environment. Kind of the case in point that I can think of most recently is ADCS stuff. So Active Directory Certificate Services. We released that research like 2 years ago. And that's been when we first released that research, we did a kind of a poll, an internal poll. We wanted to do some due diligence for our customers, right? So we reached out to a bunch of them. We found that 90% of them were vulnerable to this, basically one-click domain users to domain admins. I mean, it was incredibly pervasive. Being able to describe that attack and understand where, if that's in your environment and how you can verify that you actually fixed it, is incredibly important. And you just can't rely on the built-in tools for that. So,
and I suppose that sounds like it's a case of following good advice, because I'm not a cybersecurity expert or work in information security, but colleagues I have that do have been recommending for some years that most customers should not be running Active Directory certificate services themselves at all, or they should be using a third-party service that provides the equivalent. Or if they do, then there's a particular defined way of setting this up to.
I think that's just shifting the risk around. Like,
I think there's that part. But if you're a smaller business, for example, and you just spam one of these up, then whilst there's still risk, and you must run this thing to provision certificates for your access points and so on, then those folks are not necessarily going to be in a position where they should be. I do not know all the models for running certificate services, but offline root certificate authority and all the bits that travel down from there. I know Exchange. I know a lot of customers cannot operationally capable of running that on premises to the same degree as Microsoft, for example.
Oh yeah. I mean, I hear what you're saying there. I mean, like, ADCS is an incredibly complex system. It's incredibly powerful, but it's kind of like you can't just set that up blindly and then let it go. It's kind of like Exchange.
But people do.
I mean, through Office. Well, yeah, I know. Like, we read about it, right?
You must have come across lots of customers who have. It's just been set up at some point and left.
I think PKI is like Kerberos. Like, nobody understands Kerberos. Not even the guy who wrote Kerberos understands Kerberos,
I used to work with some HPC Unix admins who were desperate to get their boxes joined to AD and seemed to know Kerberos far better than me. But would spend hours trying to tell me stuff. Some people kind of do.
PKI is one of those areas where, like, folks are like, once it's set up, they don't want to touch it because, like, it's complex and it has dramatic, like, people get wary about touching AD to make changes, right? Close a security hole by removing this, right? Well, that generates a lot of, like, well, what am I going to break? PKI is a whole different level of that. And we found that, like, we did a poll of our customers because our intent is to show some of those routes ourselves. But we did a poll, and a lot of it was like, we've set it up and we don't touch it again because we're just it's complex. It's scary. We don't want to hear about it. It works, and so we'll just let it go.
And does that reassure or terrify you?
I think it's a reality. It's a reality that it's not reassuring or terrifying. It's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, because knowing enough to not want to ever run one, because myself, that would terrify me, I suppose.
Yeah,
because I don't know what the risks are.
Oh, I mean, like, I'll give you a really simple example. Like, 15 to 20 years ago now, I was running it. I was a junior admin of an Active Directory like subdomain, and I would add people into groups until they stopped complaining about like not having access, right? And that was just group management. And so I didn't really understand what I was doing.
I used to have someone work for me like that.
Oh yeah, I mean,
I've still got scripts on our website for finding these.
Yeah, I close tickets really quickly, right? So I'm not. It's not a reflection on the system, the user. It just is reality.
I mean, I've set up certificate surfaces before in an organisation, but they're knowing a little bit more. I would have been in the same position of being scared to touch it because of the things that what will happen to EFS and all this sort of stuff, and what touching group policies associated with it could be scary. Let alone
that group policy is a fun one. So this is kind of random, but so like ADCS, we still see like being abused quite a lot, just because of the power that it comes in. But group policy, like there was a bunch of news earlier this year about like actor groups using group policy to their advantage, because group policy is extremely complex. I mean, I don't have to like probably tell a lot of your listeners that. Understanding who has rights over group policy objects is super complicated, and honestly, we see it in a lot of customers where there will be just random users who have control over objects that apply to really privileged assets in the environment.
Because people can, and someone being rushing or trying to do the right thing, but didn't do their MCSC 2003 or whatever. Adds permissions in the wrong place.
Yeah,
of course.
And group policy, I bet
most people have went to do it at some point themselves, and then went, we better be careful. But then tracking those down, that would be.
It's hard. It's hard, right? And group policy. Matthew Vinton from the Quest organization and I are going to do a talk, and he's doing it. So we're doing a webinar post Black Hat, so like a couple weeks away, and then that's kind of a preview of a talk he's giving at Tech as well for group policy security. I think it's kind of a ticking bomb that a lot of people don't realize that exists. So when you do a penetration test, like this is kind of a preview. When you do a penetration test, a lot of people will, like the testers themselves, will abuse the privileges that they know that won't have a lot of harm in the environment, right? They're trying to get to their objective, but not, take down the organization as they do it, because their client wouldn't be too happy. Group policy is one that we see vulnerable all the time, but you can't really abuse it, because there can be dramatic effects for that. But an adversary doesn't have that type of double check, right? If they're in to like deploy ransomware, it is a very powerful tool to get that job done. And a lot of environments have vulnerable group policy objects that, again, like just have random people with privileges over them.
I suppose so. Many system admins and similar already know this. But like, if someone wants to ask you, well, if you lost your key, do you reckon you'd be able to get in your house? And group policy might be one of those things. If you didn't lose your keys, but you lose your keys to a section of the infrastructure or desktop machines, you could reverse some bad changes, password low card stuff. You can almost run anything you want against the so you know that you've got the problem in a way, don't you? But you don't. You'd be taking away your backup access card at the same time if you fully resolved it.
Well, I don't think the point is not to remove the group policy that applies to machines that gives you that access. the point is to understand who has control over that group policy, because while you may have created it some years ago for reasons, we see it quite often. I mean, we saw it this week where a very mature organization had the authenticated users group with control, right control over a group policy object that applied to thousands of systems within their organization, of which some of them were domain controllers in their Azure Sync servers. So that's a pretty atrocious misconfiguration. And nobody, when they created that group policy object, thought, you know what would be a great idea? Let's give every authenticated user in the forest the ability to write to this thing. So it's not about the group policy itself. It's who has control over the group policy.
Did they know how long it had been that way?
No.
Because that...
Years.
Yeah, that's... of course it was, right? Because if you had been that the person who was told this news, you would think, oh my God, well, I know I didn't do it.
Yeah.
I've been here 3 years, and I've been doing all I can to sort the environment. My God, this has been here since Jeff was here and Florence. Maybe before. Because unless you've got the kind of comprehensive auditing that would have helped identify this.
Yeah, that's the thing. You have to be able to identify where these configurations exist. I mean, I would say 95% of organizations that we support have some sort of very large group with some control over some object in their AD, which is a blanket misconfiguration. I mean, anytime you have the everyone group with full control over fill in the blank, there's no reason why you should have that. I challenge anybody to give me a reason why you would want something like that. It's really just a ticking bomb. So and it's so common.
And does this drive the view that people should assume that they've been breached because of it? So the Microsoft have said plan or prepare for compromise, then and build out a new environment. Then it's to avoid those kind of mistakes that have happened over the years because of the high level of admin rights that people used to get, where you go in and, a business of 1,000 people, 30 people had domain admin or had that at some point, and you can see when you look at the directory that those same people are still have the DS admin attribute assigned to them.
Are you saying that, so
is that why you should see breach, and why advice of building out or remediating this? It's possible to do it right, because some of those common misconfigurations that are everywhere are avoidable now.
Yeah, well, but I don't know that you need to build a new domain to do it. So, you don't need, because otherwise you're just going to build a new domain every year, right?
Yeah, I don't think most people will want to do that. To be fair.
No. I'm trying to check my bias here, but on you can find different open source tools that can identify a lot of this kind of low hanging fruit. I mean, I think a lot of people get wrapped up in the fact that there's so much that they can do in Active Directory, and so they kind of give up and say, let's just go focus on Azure or some other thing that is like some silver bullet. When it comes back to it, they can't escape the fact that they have to do something for Active Directory, again, because kind of things that we mentioned before, and also realize that those other silver bullets aren't. So, you're just going to misconfigure something there too. So you have to develop this internal capability with I'm going to sound probably stereotypical here, but people, process, and technology to make sure that you can validate that the configurations you're putting into system, Active Directory or Azure or whatever it is, are not spawning paths that are going to come to bite you. And I think even if you do that, even if you do have that capability, there is value, and everybody should be prepared to react to some breach, because it's like Mike Tyson, you have a plan until you get punched in the nose. You have to be ready to get punched in the nose.
Yeah. And at Tech, you're doing a couple of sessions. So do you want to tell us what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so the first one, Robbie Winchester, who's my counterpart on the services side, we're going to be doing a really cool talk on just Active Directory, well, attack paths in general. It's kind of the history of them, kind of a demonstration of how easy some of this is. So we're going to like live demonstrate some paths, and then kind of give you the so what, like why do you care, what should you do about it. So that's our keynote session, and then later in tech. I'm going to be giving a talk on kind of securing privileged access principles against delegation. So what I mean by that is a lot of customers understand that they should protect in Active Directory the well-known sensitive objects, so like domain admins, domain controllers.
Yeah.
But there's a whole lot of principles that aren't necessarily protected by admin SD holder by default that are just as sensitive as those other principles. So like just as sensitive as a domain admin or a domain controller, but they're randomly stored within an OU structure. What that ends up doing is you get like policies inherited, GPOs applied that you didn't really necessarily think that they applied. So then again, you're kind of not with eyes wide open, allowing people to inherit control over objects that are as sensitive as a domain controller. So just being aware of that these privileges principles exist, and that you understand if you house them in places in your OU structure that you're going to get privileges, i.e. attack paths that inherit down to those principles. So
that sounds interesting, because I seem to remember a time when there was certainly a less focus on the OU structure, especially when it came to things like group policies, permissions, and less. I wouldn't say the task paths in AD for delegating admins were massively used, but that structure being once very, very carefully curated, and then going to more flat structures. So it's not turning that on its head, though, is it? It's additive by the sound of it.
It's like if you were going to build an AD today, what would we suggest as your OU structure? Yeah, we could see that. We could show you that. But one thing I want to be clear of is we're not saying like, hey, everybody, your structure that you have today, switch it to this, because that's basically the equivalent of burning down your domain and starting from scratch. It's more of just a realization that you have principles within your structure that are as privileged as domain admins and domain controllers. And if there's in somewhere in another location that isn't protected by the admin SD holder process, that they're going to get privileges inherited to them. And you need to be aware of that. So, for example, a lot of people will deploy Azure Sync, right? So you're going to sync your directory to Azure. You're going to have a computer and a service account that does that sync process for you. Depending on where that computer and that service account is within your environment, you can have multiple people have control over that machine, which is the equivalent, I would argue, as a domain admin. Because the service account that's running that sync service has DC sync rights. It has get changes all. So an attacker with access over to that service account can DC sync the directory and game over, right? Like there's no reacting to that attack. It's more of a, well, they got here and they're done. So it's a realization of that, and depending on the customer and the structure, you can either just block inheritance and be aware of that, or try to control against placing those principles in random locations in the future. So
that sounds like quite a valuable session then, especially for people working on divestitures, M&A, where they need to build this right and avoid some that they may be aware of these kind of attacks that they're probably going to be the targets of because of press announcements or investor news, and are being pressured to build out the perfect place, and that's going to have those legacy apps that are rebuilt from scratch, that place to move into. They'll probably be following principles to make sure that they're not trusting the source domain as they move across, but building it the right way. It almost feels like if you just read the Microsoft documentation, you're not getting a lot of new things for AD specifically in terms of guidance that you may have got 10 years or 8 years ago, apart from structures to avoid things, that are quite generalized or conflicting advice.
Yeah, we in terms of documentation on the Microsoft side, we found that there was some lacking guidance for what constitutes a privileged entity. So, back way in the day, we just admins, right? And then they moved to tier 0, and now it's privileged access. But we've never really understood like what meets that criteria and why. So we'll explain some of that in the tech session. So what do we mean by privileged entities or access, and why we say that? And I imagine there will be some debate. I'll have some polls in our session and say, do you think that this is privileged access? And we'll see what the audience says.
I could definitely say from Tech Europe and your colleague sessions that Active Directory itself never seems that interesting on its own. These are really interesting sessions, and I watched them 3 times, and I got something new out of them every time as well. So they're definitely worth attending, because you're going to learn something actually useful as well, rather than just what's latest in this and so on.
I think. Oh yeah, I mean, I would love to say that that you're guaranteed to walk away from my session learning something new, but even if you don't, I bet you'll talk with somebody in the audience, or hear some like perspectives. One thing that I found with tech is just the people that go there. I mean, you're all kind of in the same ship together, right? We're all doing kind of the same thing, and hearing the stories and the pains and the learning lessons and the avoid that at all costs. Like that was really cool.
Yeah, that is definitely, that's the great thing about in-person conferences. It's not just the sessions; it is meeting people. And my best friend I met from conferences, Jason. We became firm friends ever since. So you meet people that you just keep in touch with as well.
Yeah.
Because it's not it's a shared career, which is a big thing, really, isn't it? When you're doing this stuff, and if you're going to a session like yours at Tech, then you're going to have something in common with not just you, but with folks in the audience. You're going to find the person sitting next to you is probably wondering the same things.
Oh yeah,
yes.
yeah, for sure.
Brilliant. So I should have booked my ticket to Atlanta already then, because I think I'm definitely sold just on this session alone. But you've got 2, as you said, and people can register now, and we'll put the website at the end of the show, or on the YouTube channel. But thank you very much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Cheers. Thank you.